Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Heritage Christian University in the Franklin Auditorium. This is study week for our students, and we have lots of activities that are planned. We had a good day on Monday, and today has been a great day as well, and so we appreciate all those who are taking part in that. As part of study week this week, we have the Jack P. Lewis lectures, which will take place here in the auditorium. The first one will be after Dr. Barrier introduces it, and then we'll have another lecture at 1 p.m. So we hope that everyone can come back at 1 to enjoy the lectures. Now I will turn over to Dr. Jeremy Barrier as he will introduce our speaker and let our new students know a little bit about the Jack P. Lewis lecture.
Good morning. Glad you all could be here today. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. The Jack P. Lewis lectures. Well, the Graduate School of Theology has 3 different lecture series, and one of them is this one, the Jack P. Lewis Biblical Research Lectures. And this is what we have recorded in the catalog, if you want to refer back to it later. The Jack P. Lewis Biblical Research Lectures allow the Graduate School of Theology to host a distinguished scholar who has dedicated his or her life to training ministers in the context of theological schools affiliated with the Churches of Christ. The lectures are named in honor of Jack P. Lewis, an internationally recognized scholar and a pioneer in biblical education within Churches of Christ. Lewis taught for many decades at the Harding School of Theology in Memphis, where he provided an example of Christian scholarship to thousands of ministers. These annual lectures, established in his honor, aim to expose the faculty and students to the variety of fields within theological education and connect HCU to sister institutions around the country. The lectures typically feature an overview of the scholar's primary field of research and a more specific lecture in which the scholar highlights his or her own research, which we'll do at lunch, and as well as an informal academic biography. Our speaker today, we're happy to have Larry Welborn with us, who is in his final year at Fordham University. A little bit about Larry Welborn, professionally speaking. He completed his PhD in 1993 from Vanderbilt. Before that, if you go back through his resume, he spent time at the University of Chicago. He also spent time in Tübingen, Germany. He spent time completing a master's at Yale Divinity School, and then before that, Harding College in Searcy. In addition to that, he's had a number of appointments professionally. Of course, professor of New Testament since 2007 at Fordham University, but before that also teaching at United Theological Seminary, also Macquarie University in Australia for a time, as well as a number of other places like McCormick Theological Seminary. I was able to get to know Larry, or Dr. Welborn, I should say, in this context. Ed Gallagher and I took a class with him in the fall of 2000. And correct me, Ed, if I'm wrong, but we can thank or blame Larry Welborn for the fact that Ed has a PhD in his field rather than mathematics. Okay, so that was where he was headed. You're looking at I have 25 years of chemical engineering experience at this point, if I had not met you. Okay, so we had a class. He taught for 1 year at Fordham University, and due to some health concerns, that tenure of staying at Fordham came to an end, unfortunately. Fortunately for you, you recovered. But we just had that brief moment, and there were other people who also got to enjoy that time when he was at Fordham. Laura Sanders Wilson, who's here with us today, as well as, unless something prohibits, Doug Burleson is going to be here at 1 o'clock today to visit as well. we all had classes together. Justin Rogers, as well as Justin's dad, Mike Rogers, we were all in the same classes together, as well as Nathan Guy. So he's populated the faculty of at least 3 of our schools that I know of, and so that's really special. He's married to Diane. They live in Dayton, Ohio. They have two sons and who are married, as well as some grandchildren as well. So thrilled that you could be here today, and we look forward to hearing all that you have to share with us.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that wonderful, generous introduction. I am indeed glad to be with you, honored to be invited to give this lecture. Jack P. Lewis was one of my father's teachers, and for my father and for many others, he was a role model. In the early 2000s, my father was a donor, a contributor to Heritage Christian University, and if I have any qualification to give this lecture today, those qualifications are the students that I taught at Fordham, whose names Jeremy has already mentioned. Now, the lecture that I'm bringing you in 2 parts today is my latest piece of work. It has not yet been published. It's a new field of research for me, but in the last 25 years, research on the experience and ideology of aging in antiquity has exploded. And until recently, very few scholars have tried to apply this new research to the study of the New Testament and the early Christians. So my lecture today is an attempt to do that. It's entitled, quoting Paul in 2 Corinthians, "Our outer person is wasting away." And the subtitle, "Paul, Cicero, and Seneca on Old Age and Death." So I'd like to begin with an overview of what I hope to accomplish today, a kind of a roadmap to this 2-part lecture. This lecture seeks to make plausible the hypothesis that the affliction, thlipsis, of which Paul speaks in 2 Corinthians 4:16 to 5:10 is related to the encroachment of age and the thought of death. That is, to Paul's struggle with what Simone de Beauvoir has termed the greatest of life's unrealizables. To comprehend Paul's difficult thoughts about old age and death, I'm undertaking a comparison with the writings of his contemporaries on the same subject, especially Cicero and Seneca. Such a comparison is facilitated by categories that have been articulated by social anthropologists. And those categories are, first, the ageless self, and its dark complement, selfless age. Now, the anthropologist categories seem to apply directly to representative figures of antiquity, which we will discuss shortly. But whether Paul's account of his aging self in 2 Corinthians can be subsumed beneath the sociologist categories is what we must seek to determine. Why? Because in Paul's paradoxical formulation, the self is strangely partitioned. Our outer person is wasting away, Paul says, but our inner person is being renewed day by day. So we will seek to discern first what has partitioned the self in Paul and whether this partition has made space for a new experience of old age. At a crucial moment in Paul's defense of his apostleship in 2 Corinthians, his thoughts turn to the harsh reality of his sufferings. Quote, "We are afflicted, perplexed, harassed, struck down. We are always being handed over to death for Jesus' sake." The afflictions have had a psychological impact against which Paul struggles. Twice, Paul heaves his heart into his chest and insists, "We do not lose heart." Yet Paul concedes that our outer person is wasting away. In poignant metaphors, Paul figures his outer nature as something dismantleable and disposable, a tent that is demolished, a garment that is stripped off. Paul admits that he would rather be away from the body. And in spite of those thoughts, or rather as a bulwark against them, Paul repeatedly asserts his confidence. Now, interpreters seek the occasion of Paul's thoughts about mortality in an affliction he experienced in Asia. Paul describes it in the first chapter of 2 Corinthians, an affliction in which his life was evidently in serious danger. Paul discloses, "We were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt within ourselves that we had received the death sentence." Scholars speculate about the precise nature of Paul's affliction. Some posit an imprisonment that Paul anticipated would end in death. Others suggest a grave illness that Paul feared might prove fatal. Whatever the cause may have been, the verb tenses Paul uses indicate a crisis with lasting effects. The verb eskekamen in chapter 1, verse 9, can denote an ongoing danger. The present diaphteratai in 4:16 describes a continual process reinforced by the phrase hemera kai hemera, day by day. That is, the deterioration of Paul's outer person and what it effectuates, along with the sighing, longing, and labored groaning, is something that he experiences and perceives daily. The paragraphs in which Paul recounts his sufferings and reflects upon the decay of his outer self are acknowledged by commentators to be among the most difficult in the Pauline corpus. The difficulty arises from a variety of sources. First, the perception of tension within the argument. Second, the appearance of change or development in Paul's eschatology from 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. Third, the abundance of unusual vocabulary in this passage. Exoanthropos, indemeo, anakainao, etc. And finally, the evidence of an anthropological dualism which Paul shares with some Greek and Roman philosophers. Consequently, the attention of interpreters has focused upon eschatological and anthropological matters, along with the source of Paul's unusual language and imagery. So, whether Paul's desire to be with the Lord after death has replaced his hope of participating in the resurrection and the parousia, whether the distinctive vocabulary of the passage is borrowed, perhaps from his opponents at Corinth, whether Paul had fully embraced the anthropological dualism of the Hellenistic philosophical tradition. This paper, however, will move in a different direction, offering a biographical and existential interpretation of 2 Corinthians 4 and 5. Such an approach is justified by certain features of the text and by what is known about events in Paul's life. As several commentators recognize, the first-person plural verbs in this passage, inkakumen in 4:16, oidamin in 5:1, and tharumen in 5:8, refer to Paul himself and not to an emotion or an understanding shared by the author and his addressees. Consequently, the statements about the wasting away of the outer person, the destruction of the earthly tent in which we live, and the longing to be away from the body are reflections of Paul's own experiences as he wrote the letter. Moreover, the unusual vocabulary of the passage is more plausibly explained as the product of originality rather than borrowing. Now, this is especially indicated by the presence of non-technical terms and expressions such as anakainao and hemera, kai hemera, and novel combinations such as oikia to skenus. It appears, to me at least, that Paul is coining new words and phrases to give expression to what he was going through. The imagery changes rapidly. The tent gives way to a house and then is replaced by clothing, followed by the figure of a journey, a contrast between being at home and being away. In other words, something drives Paul's thought forward and will not let him rest, something that cannot be grasped by a single image. At points, the sentence structure is suspended by clarifications, which are themselves interrupted by emphatic statements, evidently caused by shifting emotions. So, aspects of Paul's reflections in 2 Corinthians 4:16 to 5:10 make plausible the hypothesis that the affliction, whose significance he bravely seeks to minimize in 4:17, is related to the encroachment of age and the thought of death. Paul admits, with some hesitation, that his outer person is wasting away. And if the shifting metaphors in chapter 5, verses 1 to 5, if they leave any doubt as to the object of comparison, the explicit mention of the body, tosoma, as the place where Paul temporarily dwells and from which he would rather depart in 5:6 and 5:8 makes clear that only senescence and death can be meant. So how old was Paul when he composed the thoughts on aging and death in 2 Corinthians 4-5. In Philemon, verse 9, Paul describes himself as an old man, presbytes, and now also a prisoner of Christ Jesus. Paul's letter to Philemon was probably written during an imprisonment in Ephesus. If this imprisonment is to be identified with the affliction which Paul experienced in Asia, then we have a general indication of Paul's age. In De Specialibus Legibus, Philo uses the word presbytes to designate a man who has lived beyond the age of 60. Philo's representation is confirmed by the rather limited evidence of the papyri. For example, Papyrus Florentius, a certain victor is described as a presbytes of about 68 years. Now, although there is no agreement in ancient literature on when old age began, in sources from the 1st century BC onwards, the age of 60 is commonly mentioned as the threshold of old age. As an elderly man of about 60, Paul would have belonged to a portion of the population of the Greco-Roman world consisting of between 6 and 8%. It is moreover likely that Paul would have aged prematurely in consequence of what he had suffered as an apostle. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul lists the hardships he had endured: imprisonment, floggings, near-death experiences, 5 times the Jewish punishment of 40 lashes minus 1, 3 times beaten with rods, once he was stoned, 3 times shipwrecked, a night and a day adrift at sea. There can be little doubt that such torturous experiences would have resulted in premature aging. To comprehend Paul's difficult thoughts about old age and death in 2 Corinthians, I propose to undertake a comparison with the writings of Paul's contemporaries on the same subjects. Such a comparison is facilitated by categories recently articulated by social anthropologists: the so-called ageless self and its dark complement, selfless age. The former reflects the optimistic longing for continuity, despite advancing age, for the preservation of ego integrity up to the end of life. The latter expresses the fear of incapacity during life's final years, the notion that the old are devoid of subjective authority, consigned to the scrap heap of society as wasted lives. The anthropologist categories seem to apply directly to representative figures of antiquity. On the one hand, heroic old men like Socrates and Cato, who preserved their ethical consistency as they grew old and in the face of death. On the other, Pliny's pitiable acquaintance Domitius Tullus, who lost his faculties in old age and died a helpless invalid. Whether Paul's account of his aging self in 2 Corinthians 4-5 can be subsumed within the sociologist categories is what we must seek to determine. Because in Paul's paradoxical formulation, the self is strangely partitioned. The outer person is wasting away, but Paul's inner person is being renewed day by day. So we shall seek to discern what it is that has partitioned the self in Paul and whether this partition has made space for a new experience of old age. So let me begin with the ageless self in Cicero. Cicero's De Senectute may be regarded as the classic statement of the ideal of the ageless self, written toward the end of 43 BC, when Cicero was 62, and Atticus, to whom the work is dedicated, was 65. Cicero sought to reassure himself that older men still had a role to play in public life in the face of a series of personal and political disappointments. Cicero's beloved daughter, Tullia, had died in February of 45 BC, plunging him into grief. Caesar's control over the courts and the Senate had barred Cicero from the venues in which he had spent his career and filled him with anxiety over the fate of the Republic. And yet, Cicero's treatise on old age is more than a consolation for the losses and adversities. Cicero argues for the integrity, continuity, and authority of the self in old age, asserting the superiority of a past era in which older men were given precedence and shown respect. And for this reason, the dialogue is set in the past, in the year 150 BC, and Cicero's views of old age are placed in the mouth of the venerable Marcus Porcius Cato, who was 83 years old at the time of the dialogue. Cato, the novus homo, with dignitas, serves as the exemplar of praiseworthy old age, active and influential to the end. Now, because of time, I'm going to pass over several paragraphs in my paper that walk through Cicero's defense of old age against various accusations, vituperations. Cicero argues that old age does not take a person away from public activities, that old age does not weaken the body, or need not, that old age is not lacking in pleasures, and that old age is not to be feared in the face of death. So I will encourage you to read the De Senectute. If you have not, it's a pleasure to read, and it's the one surviving treatise from antiquity entirely devoted to old age. But let me summarize. As an affirmation of the ideal of the ageless self, Cicero's De Senectute anticipates the themes and values of modern social gerontologist, the continuity of the self through time, the integrity of the ego despite disruptions, the interpretation of the self through memory. Although Cicero does not dismiss the body as an active agent of being in the world, he locates the solidity of the self in the mind and in the will, which are capable of overriding any breaches in experience. Cicero's virtuous old man remains engaged in public life. He renounces the dissipations of youth, finds fulfillment in learning and friendship, and has no fear of death. Now, with a view to an eventual comparison with Paul's thought, part 2 of our lecture today, I just want to note that temporality, the ravages of time, is subsumed by Cicero within the life cycle of the old man who transcends time's passage, who is not fully conscious of his transience, who is not submissive to time's ravages. Death, according to Cicero, is the natural, external limit of Cicero's old man, who does not die daily, whose mortality is not the object of a close inward experience, as it is for Paul, whose soul ultimately survives the body's dissolution. By contrast with Cicero, ancient literature offers instances of the concept of selfless age, in which the old are portrayed as wasted beyond reversibility, devoid of subjectivity, and divested of social significance. In the pseudo-Platonic Axiochus, 1st century BC text, Socrates quotes from a discourse by the sophist Prodicus, who describes the effects of age upon a man. Quote, "Then old age creeps upon him unawares, into which flows all in nature that is mortal and perishable. And unless one quickly pays back living like a debt, nature stands by like a moneylender, taking security, taking sight from one, then hearing from another, and often both. And if someone resists, nature paralyzes, mutilates, or dislocates limbs." Pliny the Younger describes an acquaintance, Domitius Tullus, as a pitiful example of decrepit and dependent old age. Despite his fortune, Tullus was a helpless invalid. Quote, "Crippled and deformed in every limb, he could only enjoy his vast wealth by contemplating it, and could not even turn in bed without assistance. He also had to have his teeth cleaned and brushed for him, a squalid and pitiful detail. And when complaining about the humiliations of his infirmity, he was often heard to say that every day he licked the fingers of his own slaves." A lengthy passage in Juvenal's 10th satire preserves the most vivid and pessimistic portrayal of old age in ancient literature. Juvenal counters the prayer of most people for a long life with the candid and brutal observation, quote, "How great, how unceasing are the miseries of long old age." And Juvenal then proceeds to give a detailed account of all the degradations, sufferings, and sorrows which old age brings. I'm going to invite you, in the interest of time, to go and read the 10th satire of Juvenal. It is the most devastating account of pitiable old age, selfless age, a relentless portrayal. And so once again, I will simply summarize, with reference to Paul, the portraits of the old in this literature, mainly popular literature, poetry, comedy, conform to the social gerontologist's notion of selfless age. Indeed, the lineaments are starker and the colors darker than in modern depictions of helpless old age, which tend to be restrained by idealistic, humanistic values. The old are wasted in body and mind, unable to confer meaning upon their final years, objects of pity and even disgust to their family and friends. Again, in anticipation of a comparison with Paul later today, it is initially surprising how much Paul's self-presentation in 2 Corinthians 4:7 to 5:10 has in common with the poignant accounts of the aged. In ancient popular literature, Paul is compassed about with afflictions. Paul asserts that he bears in his body a process of dying away, necrosis. Consequently, his outer person is decaying. Yet, distinctive, listen to this, distinctive in Paul's account is his self-awareness. In portraits of the old, both ancient and modern, selfless age is what happens to other people, to others. Whereas Paul, surprisingly, recognizes this condition in himself. Now, I'm going to pause at that point at a moment of suspense and hope that I've said enough to intrigue you to come back for the second lecture, in which I will compare Paul, Cicero, and Seneca with respect to old age and death in three respects. First, time. How do they experience the passage of time? Second, death. What is their attitude toward death? And finally, the self. How is the self portrayed? But I'll pause at this point. Mark Twain said, "It's a terrible death to be talked to death." And you are in danger of dying that death. So let me pause now. And Jeremy, do we have time for a few questions before we go to lunch? Questions just about what you have heard so far. Please, anyone here who may be as old as I am. Yes, Jeremy.
Do you look at, I know we're looking at 2 Corinthians 4 and 5 here. Have your inquiries led you to look at other Pauline passages as well?
Oh, I hope to do that. Eventually, I would like to extend my studies of aging in Paul. In the next issue of the journal New Testament Studies, the Cambridge Journal, I have an essay. It's already in the press, entitled "The Old Paul." And the subtitle is Philemon, verse 9, and recent scholarship on the experience and ideology of aging. So that's my first. That was actually a predecessor to what you're hearing today. Beyond this, I would like to look at the letters of Paul to the Philippians, where Paul is clearly grappling with the possibility that his life will be poured out like a drink offering on the altar. He tells the Corinthians, "I'm in a strait between two. I would like to go on and be with the Lord, but it's better for me to stay here and be helpful to you, and which I would choose." The verb in the earliest manuscripts, Jeremy, is subjunctive. Which I would choose, which I might choose. If a choice were given to me, Paul says, I do not make known. And then finally, I would like to look at Paul's, what is probably Paul's last letter, the Epistle to the Romans, where Paul portrays himself as being killed all the day long. And yet, he lives in the consciousness that nothing can separate him from the love of God in Christ Jesus. So I'm projecting now a little book with about 5 chapters called The Old Paul that I would like to complete someday. Thank you. Good question. Other questions or comments? Yes, thank you.
We were talking earlier mentioned that you're soon to retire.
Yes.
I've done it twice. I recommend it. Retire from retiring. I've always felt that, and in my age, more so, that the Lord will find me when He wants to call me home. I just want to have to look around a bit. I want to stay busy. I want to be about something. And it's that thought that came to mind while you were speaking all over again. We were talking about it just a moment before, but that maybe this is part of what's going on in Paul, that he recognizes the wasting of his body, but that doesn't keep him from the dreams of his calling, the dreams of his spiritual gifts that won't let him quit.
Exactly. Exactly. You're anticipating and you're on the right track, I would say. In my first essay on this subject, on Philemon 9, I point out that the extraordinary confidence that Paul shows in writing to Philemon, suggesting to Philemon what he should do with his slave Onesimus, and threatening to come and check up on the treatment that is being afforded to the young man. This extraordinary confidence of the old Paul, who is not only old, he is a prisoner when he writes this letter. Where does that come from, right? Paul is not like other old men of his class, an artisan who supports himself by the work of his hands when he's able. Paul, in his extraordinary confidence, is more like Cato and Cicero. And I think we have to look deeply into Paul's experience of his being in Christ, this mystical identification that he has with the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, to understand where this mysterious confidence comes from. Thank you for that very good observation. Yes?
In the context in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul begins to contemplate mortality because of persecution. And the whole concept of being afflicted and sharing in the death of Jesus, facing death every day because of Jesus. So you have this added layer to mortality and growing old, in that there's the potential he deals with that he won't be able to grow old because he's facing the possibility of death on an everyday basis. I just would be interested, as you dealt with mortality and aging and faith as we age, the added layer here in this context of persecution and the impact that has on the body and the possibility of not being able to age. And did you have any of those kind of discussions coming up in some of what you read from Cicero, Seneca, etc.? So that may not be something that came up, it was just something that...
No, it's a very good question. If I can persuade you to come back at 1 o'clock, we will turn our attention to Seneca. Seneca lived under the constant threat. He lived in constant fear of Nero, who finally, as you know, ordered Seneca to commit suicide. So in that case, too, we have an interesting basis for comparison with Paul, an older man whose life is in danger from the powers that be. And at that point, Seneca and Paul offer much more material for comparison, noticing not only similarities, but also differences. Of course, Seneca was a billionaire, the Bill Gates of the first century. And even though Seneca asserted repeatedly in his letters to Cilliers that he was ready to commit suicide at any point, in fact, he waited until Nero gave him the order. But thank you for that question. Yes, we will turn our attention to the relationship between age, mortality, and persecution. when we come back. Thank you. Jeremy, are we ready for lunch?
I'll say a few words. If I can have you stay up here, but
Oh, okay.
let me take the mic
All
here.
right.
I think in this presentation, you have been able to get some of the flavor of, even in talking about the ravages of old age and forced suicide and the joy with which Professor Welborn discusses these issues. I mean, that is what I remember from that Greek class 25 years ago, is the joy with which every word of Greek in the NA 27, I think it was analyzed, and we got out our copy of Denker, and the joy with which he would exegete the entries in Denker. And I will remind you, Professor Welborn, that in that semester, I was the first one on campus who had a copy of the 3rd edition of Denker that came out just that year. That's right. And I had ordered it from this new company called Amazon a year and a half earlier, and I was afraid, because you know the internet will steal your information. I wasn't going to put a credit card. I sent in a check to Amazon. That is true, and I had a copy of Denker, and I remember showing you that copy of Denker and the excitement with which you greeted this holy relic. I still remember those words coming out of your mouth. So I want to say thank you for the joy that you displayed in biblical studies, both analyzing the Bible, interacting with scholarship, and that has been a lasting influence on me. Thank you very much for coming and sharing that with our students and faculty and staff as well. And we have this plaque that I want to present to you on behalf of the university. Heritage Christian University, the Jack P. Lewis Lectures, August 26th, 2025, presented to Dr. Larry Welborn in recognition of his dedication to theological education and Christian scholarship.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Really appreciate it. Kind words.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful.
We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to the second lecture, and now we are dismissed to lunch.
Thank you. You were the first one that showed me that great work of Denker. You know, in my first job at McCormick, they didn't have room to rent me an office.